What do bananas and ovarian follicles have in common? One of the most common questions I get when it comes to egg retrieval cycles is, why didn't I get X number of eggs when you saw X number of follicles? For instance, if you had 15 growing follicles right before the trigger shot, but we only got 10 eggs at retrieval, what happened to the other 5? Were those follicles just empty? So to explain this, I tend to use the example of ripe versus not so ripe green bananas. Now, I want you to think back to a time you've ever tried to peel a very unripe green banana. It's hard to open, right? Unlike a very ripe banana, which is just a day or so away from being great for banana bread. It's really ripe. It kind of just easily comes apart. See, sometimes when it's super ripe, it just kind of falls apart and it's really easy to get to the banana inside. Here's a picture of an ovary on ultrasound as we're nearing time of retrieval. You can see these bubbles of fluid. Each of these are called follicles, and they contain a microscopic egg that's floating inside. Now, they look like they're different sizes because it's normal for them to grow at different rates, but the goal is to get as many of them to a mature size, usually at least 18 millimeters in diameter, before we give the trigger shot. And having a bunch at that mature size with several following closely behind is usually the goal. When we go to do the actual retrieval, we're doing it under ultrasound guidance, and you can actually see the needle going through the vaginal wall into the ovary, and we drain each of these bubbles of fluid until they collapse. And we drain every single one because any eggs that are available that we can see in follicles are going to be thrown out or wasted this cycle. So even if they're small, we try to get as many as we can get because we know from experience that even follicles that are 14 millimeters in diameter on day of trigger can continue to grow and mature and yield a mature egg at time of retrieval. So you really never know what you're going to get until you actually drain the follicles and then look at the fluid under the microscope and have the embryologist count what we got. And not every egg at retrieval is guaranteed to be at the right stage of development or mature. So this is something that can be assessed later on, several hours after the retrieval. Getting back to the bananas, think of these larger mature follicles as being more like the ripe banana, where when you go in with the needle, it's really easy to pluck that egg out. It's easy to detach from the wall of the follicle, whereas some of these smaller follicles, they're much more like the green unripe banana that's harder to peel. It's much harder to pierce the follicle and to successfully detach that egg and retrieve an egg. So not every follicle is guaranteed to yield an egg, and often when we get a lower yield of eggs at retrieval than the follicles that were counted, it's usually because of low maturity. This is why when we do a baseline count, I always explain to patients, this is giving us a ballpark estimate of what your potential could be. But we know that if you have a baseline count of 15 follicles, you could get 20, 25 eggs at retrieval. And that doesn't mean that magically new follicles appear. It's just we're looking at a two-dimensional picture of something that is a three-dimensional structure. And so there were clearly little follicles in there that were capable of responding and yielding an egg that weren't seen at the baseline. Similarly, you can start out with a higher number and end up with lower numbers of eggs at retrieval. So now you know why it's not always a 1-to-1 ratio when it comes to follicles and the eggs they contain. And now you also know why I'm always craving bananas for breakfast after morning scans.